As we saw in my last video, during World War II, German prisoners of war of the United States and Britain were treated remarkably well. Germany's treatment of prisoners of war is an entirely different story. Germany is an interesting country to examine because their treatment of POWs varies so widely depending on who the POWs were. Germany signed the Geneva Convention in 1929. In accordance with the convention, Germany in most cases treated American and British POWs as best they could. However, I want to begin looking at French POWs in Germany. Germany launched their invasion of France on May 10, 1940. The invasion was massive. The Germans gathered 3.3 million men, 2,400 tanks, and 5,638 aircraft, and they poured them into neutral Belgium on their way to France. The French were quickly overwhelmed and found themselves fighting for survival. In 1 month, the French army had suffered 100,000 deaths, and their government was in talks to surrender. On June 25, 1940, 1 month and 2 weeks after the invasion had begun, France fell and signed an armistice with Nazi Germany. For France itself, the country was split in half. The northern half was directly occupied by the German army. This area would become the occupied zone. Meanwhile, the southern half of France would be ruled by a puppet government of the Germans. This area would be called Vichy France. Vichy France was ruled by French General Philippe Pétain. In the war, Germany managed to capture 1.8 million French soldiers, or 10% of the total male population of France, and held them as prisoners of war. The Germans told them that their war was over, but in reality they would experience 5 years of imprisonment, away from their families as their loved ones lived under the tyranny of Nazi rule. Before we look into the lives of French POWs, I think it is important to look at how their imprisonment affected the lives of their families. While their husbands and sons were held in captivity in Germany, the families of the POWs suffered a great deal from their absence. In France, men were the main income earners in families. With 10% of the male population gone, women were forced into roles they were not accustomed to. They started their own businesses and farms, and many had to look for employment. In Vichy France, the government, now ruled by the authoritarian Philippe Pétain, began what they called a moral rejuvenation of France. The government became obsessed with family values and worried about infidelity among the wives of POWs and tried to dissuade women from joining the workforce. This made life even more difficult for the wives of POWs. Their income plummeted and their standards of living drastically fell. As everyone struggled with either occupation or living under a new authoritarian and collaborative regime, the families of nearly 2 million prisoners of war suffered even more. To dissuade infidelity, Pétain's government made abortion an offense punishable by death. One woman was guillotined for administering an abortion. She became the last woman in French history to be guillotined. For women who did have affairs, they were treated as no more than prostitutes in their communities. The French prisoners were initially held in camps located in France itself. But after many escapes, the Germans decided to relocate their French prisoners to Germany itself. The treatment that these POWs experienced was largely based on their ethnicity. Around 120,000 of these POWs were from French colonial possessions in Africa. As most of these soldiers were black, they were often faced with horrible conditions in German prison camps. During the battle for France, the Germans lined up and shot an estimated 1,000 to 1,500 black French soldiers, rather than take them as prisoners. The Nazis were hesitant to allow any black prisoners onto German territory, out of fear that supposed German racial purity might be compromised. Instead, the Germans kept them in prisons spread across France, and often used them as human test subjects for medical and anthropological experiments. Throughout the war, Germany allowed a small trickle of POWs to return home in exchange for certain actions by Vichy France. It quickly became obvious that Germany was holding on to the POWs as hostages to ensure that the French continued to cooperate with the German conquerors. The POWs who did get to return early were treated horribly by the French. The French were very suspicious of these POWs. The French believed they were being sent back as collaborators and were often viewed as traitors. For the prisoners who were forced to live as prisoners until the German defeat, the biggest issue they would face was starvation. As Germany began to lose the war, feeding prisoners became a lower priority. This resulted in widespread starvation and disease. The camps that these prisoners inhabited were squalid, and many of these soldiers died due to their poor conditions. When Germany was finally defeated on May 7, 1945, the French prisoners who had been trying to survive their long captivity finally got to return home. Most of these prisoners had very little, if any, contact with their loved ones. Most of these prisoners had no idea if their families even survived the Nazi occupation. But as they made their way home, they were disappointed to discover that they were never welcomed back as heroes, but were met with disdain by their countrymen. The French viewed these returning POWs as cowards and blamed them for allowing France to fall into the brutal hands of the Nazis.